You have read Hebrews 11 100 times, but have you ever wondered why the early church and the saints through the ages called this chapter the most precious page in the Bible? There is a pattern there that upends common sense and comforts the trembling heart at once. A startling truth waits in plain sight. The chapter that lists heroes of faith is not a museum of distant saints, but a map for how the living God moves through ordinary lives. Hebrews 11 says plainly in verse 1 that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And that sentence alone reframes every miracle you have ever longed to see. Picture two brothers standing at a small altar with the smell of smoke in the air and the sun burning on their shoulders. One places the choicest portion, while another sets aside leftovers. One of them will be commended by God. Genesis 4:4 records that Abel brought of the firstlings, and Hebrews 11 later holds him up as an example. That single choice of the heart echoes through the rest of redemptive history and tells us that God values the motive of the offering more than the size. This is not hopeful thinking or spiritual bargaining. It is a living dynamic that transforms promise into possession. If you are facing something that seems impossible today, the way you approach God at this moment matters. We will walk through the witnesses named in Hebrews 11 and see how the same principle operates again and again. And then we will come home with practical steps you can take this week to align your life with that chapter. The story of Abel and Cain begins in a field that smelled of freshly turned earth and the soft exposed skin of a shepherd boy who had been up before dawn. And the story begins with a choice. The air tasted of smoke and lamb fat. Cain came in with soil on his hands and annoyance in his jaw. Abel came in with wool clinging to his forearms and reverent footsteps. Cain said under his breath to Abel, "Why are you favored?" Abel answered quietly, "I bring what my heart holds best." Cain snapped back, "My crops are everything to me. Why would mine not be enough?" Abel answered, "It is not the size of the gift, but the surrender of the giver." Cain's face flushed, his hands ate into the dirt, and the field heard the exchange. The scene is sparse in the text, but heavy with sensory detail. The crunch of grain underfoot, the salt of sweat on the lip, the metallic tang of jealousy. Genesis 4:4 records that the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, and Hebrews 11 returns to say that by faith Abel was commended as righteous. The application is clear. When the altar receives your best, the divine hand moves. If you feel your offerings are small, bring them honestly and humbly, and do so as worship, not as exchange. There is also a shadow in Cain that warns us. Jealousy festers into violence when the heart is not healed. The theological point is simple and severe. God looks at the heart and rewards faith that is worship. You must choose what you bring and how you bring it. Before we travel further, take hold of a deeper witness. Enoch and Noah teach us two routes of faith: intimacy and obedience. Imagine Enoch moving through a city full of noise with a quietness on his face, a person whose eyes were trained on a presence others could not see. The morning air clung to his cloak, his breath warmed in the cold, and the smell of lamp oil and animal skin hung in the alleys as he walked. People called out his name, and he answered with a blessing. In a crowded market, a friend named Laban said, "How can you live like that, always talking of a God no one has seen?" Enoch said, "Because I walk with him every day." Laban pushed back, "Prove it. Where is God when famine comes?" Enoch smiled and laid a hand on a child's head. "He is nearer than your next breath." Laban left unconvinced, but others listened. Hebrews 11:5 tells us that by faith Enoch was taken up so that he did not see death. The sensory presence of Enoch is quiet but tangible: the creak of his sandal, the warmth of his greeting, the fragrance of faith. Now see Noah hammering timber on dry ground. The sun kissed his shoulders, the dust rose with each stroke of the axe, and children in the street mimicked the sound with sticks and laughter. The air tasted of resin and pitch. Neighbors shouted, "You have lost your mind building on parched earth." Noah replied, "The Lord spoke, and I build." A skeptic named Tob saw the ribs of the ark and said, "You will drown us all with your imagination." Noah answered, "This is not imagination. This is obedience to a warning." Tob laughed and spat, the voice of ridicule ringing against unfinished planks. Genesis 6 and Hebrews 11:7 highlight Noah, whose obedience to what was not yet visible earned salvation for his household. The pattern is intimate communion that fuels courageous action. Enoch shows the inner journey with God. Noah shows the outward labor of faith when the world scoffs. If you are compelled by these stories, pause here and respond, because the community matters. If this message touches you and you are carrying an impossible ask in your heart, share with us in the comments what that impossible is. Begin your comment with the words, "My impossible is," so I can find it easily. Do not be vague. Tell us one concrete sentence that names the burden, the work, the relationship, the healing, or the hope. By writing it, you do not perform a ritual. You place a claim on communal prayer, and you invite others to stand with you. Many reading these lines will nod and think they are alone. But when you type your real struggle, you offer a space for empathy and prayer. This channel will compile those testimonies, and in future episodes, we will share how the principles unfolding from Hebrews 11 turn specific situations into testimonies. Your vulnerability helps others and gives us raw material to demonstrate how these biblical patterns work in real life. Hearing your story also trains us to minister with humility and precision. And when we see the repeated themes, we can craft prayers and practical steps tailored to your need. So right now, my impossible is, and tell us in one sentence what only you might say out loud to a trusted friend. The comments section will not heal everything, but it will start a chain of prayer and solidarity. We now turn to Abraham and Sarah, the great testing of a promise. Abraham heard the call to leave his country, and the smell of the burned offering lingered around the tent posts as he moved his family under foreign stars. The desert winds tasted of dust and hope. Sarah felt the pinch of barrenness in her body and the mocking of relatives in her ears. God said to Abraham in Genesis 12 and again in Genesis 15 and 17, "I will make you into a great nation." The promise echoed as both threat and gift. Abraham answered by packing his tent stakes and walking. On the road, a young servant named Eliezer asked, "Where are we going?" Abraham said, "Where God points." Eliezer hesitated. "Do you not fear the unknown?" Abraham replied, "I fear God more than the unknown." Sarah sat with a pot of lentils and whispered to her sister Rebekah, "How can a promise become a child in this body?" Rebekah answered, "By waiting and by grasping the hand of God." There is a moment when God tests Abraham by asking him to offer Isaac, a terrible scene recorded in Genesis 22 where obedience collides with promise. The dialogue on the mountain becomes tight. Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham answers, "God will provide." The knife is raised and God stops the hand, and a ram is provided. Hebrews 11:8-19 commends Abraham for obeying even when promise and command seem to contradict. The backstory of Abraham is crucial to understand who he was and why his obedience carried such weight. He was born Abram into a family of idol makers, the son of Terah. As a young man, he had exposure to pagan altars and household gods. He learned the craft of worshiping physical things before the call redirected his heart. When God spoke, his life underwent a radical turn from local identity to covenant identity. He endured long seasons with a promise as his anchor, losing his homeland and, later, momentarily his sense of what God would require. He faced temptation to substitute Hagar for the promise and felt the sting of complicated family dynamics that lingered for generations. But he kept returning to the voice that called him beyond his known world. In the middle of barrenness and promise, he cultivated a posture of pilgrimage, not mere tourism. He learned to invest trust in the character of God more than in immediate evidence. That training made him the father of nations and the exemplar whose faith is rehearsed in Hebrews 11. His backstory shows formation through loss, doubt, wandering, and final surrender. Next, we follow Jacob and Joseph, a cascade of deception, reconciliation, and providential design. Jacob wrestled at night, his skin carrying the memory of deceit, the cool air smelling of river and raw fear. A man asked, "Who are you?" Jacob answered, "I am Jacob." The man said, "No longer will you be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have striven with God and with men." Jacob limped away with a new name and a new destiny. The household had many secondary players: Simeon, Reuben, Leah, and Rachel, all of whom shaped family tension. Joseph was sold into Egypt by jealous brothers, their hands still smelling of dust and betrayal. Potiphar, the Egyptian officer, trusted Joseph and later locked him away when temptation rose. In prison, Joseph interpreted dreams for Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Their whispers and the faint scent of yeast and oil filled the cell. When famine came, his skill saved nations, and his forgiveness healed a family broken by envy. He instructed that his bones be carried from Egypt when God delivered Israel, a physical sign of hope, a future proof that promises do not die in foreign soil. Secondary characters named along the way include Caleb, Miriam, Zipporah, Potiphar, Reuben, Judah, and Tamar, each performing a concrete role in the narrative and each recognizable in the texture of family life. Their actions show that legacy is not only genetic, it is moral and spiritual. Moses enters as a story of identity and corporate rescue. He smelled the rushes by the river, the brittle papyrus under his palms when he was adopted, and he heard the weeping of his people at night. He saw a burning bush that did not consume the bush, Exodus 3 records. The divine encounter where God said, "I have seen the affliction of my people, and I will deliver them." Moses argued, "Who am I to go?" God said, "I will be with you." Moses confronted Pharaoh in a palace full of perfumed tapestries and sharp commands, and the stakes were cosmic. The plagues brought a smell of rot and the taste of ash, and the night of the Passover tasted of bitter herbs and lamb. The crossing of the sea was a public miracle, with a wind smelling of salt and the roar of surf. And Hebrews 11:29 remembers the faith that caused the walls of water to stand. People named Miriam, Aaron, Joshua, and Hur play active roles, cheering and steadying a frightened people. In the wake of deliverance, a procedural detail stands out for us. Anyone who has led a large group from oppression to freedom knows logistics matter: tents, provisions, leadership structure, and clear communication. When Moses organized the people, he delegated judges, maintained tents, and set a schedule for worship and movement. The technical side of leading a covenant community required discipline and order as much as prophetic courage. We then arrive at moments of strategic warfare and surprising wisdom. Jericho, Rahab, Gideon, and Barak show how God subverts human strategy. In Jericho, the air was thick with the dust of watchful sentries, and the trumpet calls sounded like the beating of a god. The city walls seemed immovable until obedience met a strange command. Walk around once a day, and on the seventh day march 7 times and shout. A woman named Rahab hid spies in her roof. She felt the weight of a scarlet cord and risked her reputation for the promise of protection. She said, "I know the Lord has given you this land. Protect my family." The spies promised safety for her household, and her faith was reckoned to her as righteousness. Gideon heard the threshing of wheat in secret and the soft rustle of his cloak as he hid from Midianites. An angel called him mighty warrior, and he replied, "But my clan is the weakest." God pared down Gideon's forces until victory came by the sound of jars broken and trumpets shouting. Judges 7 records a tactical plan that made no sense in military terms, but worked by divine design. Barak went into battle under Deborah's prophetic word and learned that obedience sometimes requires following a voice you do not expect to trust. Sensory detail is thick here: the scrape of shields, the smell of smoke, the metal tang of fear, and the echo of horns. The tactical description of Jericho and Gideon contains an odd specificity. There is a procedure to follow in both cases: march, listen, break, and shout. And that obedience becomes the instrument of victory. The stories of the judges, Samson, Jephthah, and the rise of Samuel and David show fall, failure, and restoration. Samson felt the pull of a Philistine dance, the smell of perfume on Delilah's hair, and the tug of sin on his inner man. Jephthah made a vow that fruitlessly bound him to tragic consequences, yet in humility he found a measure of deliverance for his people. David faced Goliath in a field thick with the smell of sweat and fear, and with a sling and 5 smooth stones he called a name of the Lord, and the giant fell. David then sinned and repented and wrote psalms that still describe the interior ache of contrition. Psalm 51 rings with rawness and hope. Prophets like Samuel and Elijah endured mockery, persecution, and loneliness, yet their words became the hinge of history. In these scenes, the voice of failure is counterbalanced by the word of hope. There is a moment of tension in each character when memory of past sin collides with the call to act for God. Samson remembers Philistine drums and makes a tragic choice. Jephthah faces a crowd and hears his own rash words echo back. David looks at Bathsheba and then at Uriah and chooses a path that costs dearly. Each moment contains the anatomy of temptation, remorse, and the slow work of restoration. Each story is both a warning and a promise. The theological point is that faith is not sinless perfection, but a trajectory of return. As we move toward the New Testament, the catalog widens and includes martyrs and ordinary people who paid with life for their testimony, their breath mingling with the smoke of persecution, their hands bound and mouths sealed, yet their witness ringing. Hebrews 11 culminates by reminding us that these received a good testimony through faith, yet did not receive the promise in full. They died in faith, believing for a city built by God. The cloud of witnesses around us is thick with names and stories from the Psalms and from 1 Samuel, where kings and prophets learned to trust despite failure. Consider those whose lives were extinguished in ancient arenas and whose stories became seeds in soil they would never see. Their testimonies are practical rather than theoretical. When persecution comes, what do? You remember their example, you place your trust in God, and you act in line with that trust. We now pause for application. Hebrews 11 functions as a manual for the life of faith, not a trophy shelf. What are the actionable steps you can take this week to align your life with the chapter? First, bring your best to the altar, whether that is time, money, service, or vulnerability. Second, cultivate intimacy with God, like Enoch, through regular listening, prayers, morning and evening, even when results are not visible. Third, be willing to do the labor of obedience, like Noah, and do the long work even under ridicule. Fourth, trust promises and be ready to sacrifice for them, like Abraham did. Fifth, forgive and steward legacy, like Joseph, turning betrayal into provision. These are practical disciplines, not slogans. Set a concrete appointment for prayer 3 times this week. Write a letter you have postponed. Offer the best of your resources to someone who cannot repay, and find one small obedience to perform, even if it looks foolish. Technical note on process. When leading communal acts of faith in practical terms, clear roles reduce confusion. Designate a coordinator and assign simple tasks like water, food, shelter, prayer, watch, and reporting. Record the steps and review daily. Maintain lines of accountability and set measurable but faith-filled goals. This is not spiritual perfection, but functional organization, and it often distinguishes hopeful activism from chaos. Before we close, there is a long epilogue in 3 temporal checkpoints to show how these patterns play out over time. At 1 month, imagine you have taken one simple step in faith. You chose to bring your best to the altar, or you obeyed a small command. 1 month later, you will likely feel a combination of doubt and confirmation. The initial adrenaline may have worn off, and the world may not yet have changed, but you will have a new memory. You will know that you acted differently. That new memory informs your identity, and it begins to rewire your habits. In practical terms, review that first step. Write down what you learned about your heart. Share that short testimony with a friend and request prayer. Community response often accelerates what you began alone. Keep a log of small wins and setbacks, because faith is built in the ledger of faithful acts. At 3 months, the pattern deepens. Repetition creates muscle memory for obedience. If you have continued in the practices recommended, you will notice subtle but real changes. Your conversations will begin to turn toward hope. Your fear will recede at key moments, and your ability to wait will have improved. This is where stories from Hebrews 11 matter most. You will recognize some of the same dynamics in your life that you read about in Abraham or Joseph. Your small acts of obedience may have produced ripples. Someone may have noticed a kindness or a change in leadership style, and doors may open. At this stage, reassess your commitments, prune what is unsustainable, and double down on disciplines that produce growth. Invite accountability partners, Caleb or Miriam, or another trustworthy friend to help you persist. Keep journaling, ask for feedback, and be teachable. At 6 months, the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Habits become character, and character shapes destiny. If you have persisted in bringing your best and in obeying God in visible and private ways, you will now have an archive of signs and small miracles to read back. Promises may not always be fulfilled in the timetable you expected, but by this stage, you can trace a trajectory and testify to others. You will now be able to stand before someone else with a story and with the authority of experience to say, "I have walked this road, and here is what faith requires." This 6-month epilogue often includes shifts in relationships, deeper trust from God, and sometimes public changes that affect vocation, family, or ministry. Prepare practical next steps for stewardship of these gains, friend groups, prayer rhythms, and financial planning to ensure that the fruit of your faith is kept and shared. Record specific testimonies and offer them back to your community so that the cloud of witnesses grows tangible. These 3 temporal glimpses show that faith is not a one-time event, but a time-shaped way of life with measurable markers. We have named secondary characters through the story: Caleb, Miriam, Zipporah, Potiphar, Reuben, Judah, Gideon, and Rahab, each performing concrete roles and showing that faith operates in networks. We have also rehearsed tensions when memory and doubt rise, and we have lingered at the crossroads where obedience must be chosen despite cost. Hebrews 11 sits at the theological center of this instruction. It binds promise and action and calls us to a faithful trajectory. The conclusion is simple and urgent. Bring your best to the altar. Act in obedience even when instruction seems foolish. Expect the miraculous to happen in the public square. Do not be ashamed of small faithful acts and keep records of grace. If this message landed on your heart, subscribe to this channel to travel together in the study of these witnesses. Share the video with someone who needs to be reminded that faith is the thread connecting promise to miracle. Remember the chapter that changed everything. Hebrews 11 is not a list to memorize. It is a way of life to embody. You do not run alone. There is a great cloud of witnesses cheering you on. Choose a first faithful step now and write in the comments, "My impossible is," and name it so we can pray and march with you. Keep running with perseverance and let faith be the bridge between the promise you have read and the miracle you will one day declare.